All right, I think we're live. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carlos Gonçalves, and I'm VP of Growth at Jscrambler. I'm responsible for go-to-market strategy as well as partnerships and alliances. Joining me today, I have Tim Hartog. Tim is responsible for Zimperium's mobile application security solution for the fintech industry. Hi, Tim. Good to see you. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
All right, sounds good. All right, so today we are proposing a discussion on the state of application security in North American banking, and we decided to take a particular focus on mobile application security and why it should be a particular concern for organizations in this sector. To give you an overview, we will start by getting a better understanding of the main cybersecurity challenges faced by players in this industry. Then we will take a closer look at the new threats being faced at a mobile app level and how regulations in the industry are looking at this problem. Finally, Tim and I will try to propose some recommendations on what you should consider when looking for solutions to these threats and how organizations can prevent them effectively. Please note that at the end of the webinar, we will have some time to answer your questions, but you can write your questions at any time on the chat box you see there, and we'll address them at the end. Sounds good? So let's get started. All right, so we'd like to talk about a bit about online banking and the digital transformation that has been undergoing in this area. We all know that online banking is established in our daily lives. We all know we aren't required to visit a bank branch anymore in order to complete any basic online banking transactions that we need to do on a daily basis. Actually, I don't think I can remember the last time I visited one. I don't know about you, Tim. Um, today, and the truth is that today, more than ever, you only need a device, an internet connection, your personal details, and you're ready to take care of everything online, right? However, the point is that this presents new challenges, as we can see by the numbers on this slide. So just a couple numbers I found interesting. 3.6 billion is the estimated number of global online banking users by 2024. And this number will certainly keep growing. And 5.97 million US dollars was the average cost of a data breach in the financial services industry in 2022, according to this report. So this already shows the magnitude of what we're talking about here. And then we have payments, which are as well more and more cashless and digital. And that sense of physical security of no longer carrying money in your wallet is indeed now replaced by threats that come with the new technologies and the innovative solutions that we are using nowadays in the payments industry. So cybersecurity is of particular concern for the financial services industry because, as the saying goes, that's where the money is, right? So for these reasons, financial and banking firms all over the world, and in particular, of course, in the US, must put cybersecurity first above all else, given the exposure and the volume of sensitive data managed in this sector. And one point that we wanted really to talk about today is that it is more than time to pay attention to this now, because the way to solve these problems is by placing cybersecurity as part of the plan when these investments in new technologies are being done. So whenever there's a new application being planned, whenever a new release is being done, cybersecurity needs to be part of the plan. So that's the way we will be able to establish new ways of doing business and in a secure way, and taking into account the users sensitive data. Let me go to next slide. So I'm talking about threats and then the problems that come, but I wanted to focus on some particular examples that organizations can face today. And Tim, I know you'll talk more about threats you're seeing on your side, but feel free to chime in if you want to add something on any of these I'm going to be explaining. So some of these examples you're seeing here, like ransomware or denial of service, companies are increasingly aware of and already investing to prevent or mitigate them. There are others, though, like supply chain attacks or app tampering, for example, that, although not completely unknown to many, are still not being tackled properly. And I'd like to focus a bit more on the last three because those are the ones Jscrambler and Zimperium can actually help with more directly. Excuse me. And that we are actually seeing on the rise when we're talking to customers. So focusing on the first one, account takeover, sensitive data exfiltration. So a good example of this, according to our experience, is related to web forms. JavaScript is commonly used to create web forms that handle sensitive logic, such as credit card data or user credentials on web banking or even on payment platforms. And the problem is that if this JavaScript is exposed, attackers can tamper with this logic, the logic that is behind those web forms, and they can exfiltrate data or even completely alter the user experience on the whole website, really. Another type of attack that has been growing tremendously these last few years are supply chain attacks. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about these, especially when they happen on the server side. There's been a lot of conversation around this topic recently. These happen when a third-party vendor is compromised, leading to a breach of sensitive information that that vendor may be accessing. And that access can be intentional or not, right? The thing is that these don't happen only on server side. Attackers are increasingly focusing on compromising third-party vendors that are being used on the websites where users are inserting their banking credentials, their credit card information, and so on. And the issue is that a website nowadays has dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of code from all types of third parties, right? It could be user analytics, for example, marketing technologies that are super helpful for these teams, or video players with some kind of corporate video or advertising. It could be social media pixels. They're everywhere, right? There are really a lot of examples of these running on a website. And the problem is this is a complete blind spot for organizations. So attackers know this, obviously, and use this as a vector of attack to exfiltrate that, that important sensitive information that those websites are dealing with, right? And finally, app tampering. So in this example of threat, the tampering techniques are used to change the behavior of really any application, right? If the code is exposed, attackers can understand how an app is built, tamper with it, change its functionality, automate attacks against it. Basically, their goal is to compromise the integrity of the application and pave their way to other types of attacks even. So I guess this already gives you kind of an idea of the types of threats that are becoming more prevalent in the industry. And yeah, those are like the key ones that that at least from my side, I would like to talk about. But Tim, do you want to explain us more how this is like a problem for mobile, more in particular, these type of attacks?
Yeah, I think many of the attacks you mentioned here are similarly applicable to mobile apps. So the first one in terms of account takeover or data exfiltration. Many apps can be used or can use web scripts or web views or JavaScript, but you also have apps developed in other languages, native or Java or else. And you also see that these pure mobile apps are essentially subject to similar attacks or threats, though the way of doing that is typically slightly different. One good example, especially in the financial space or in the banking space related to account takeover, are, for instance, mobile malwares, which become more and more sophisticated with the capabilities to steal user credentials, including 2FA or MFA. So where you have tokens generated on the device or SMS sent to the device by the bank in order to have a second form of authentication. These can be quite straightforward, be intercepted by modern strains of malware in order to take over the account of a user. It even goes further nowadays that these pieces of malware can also instrument or tamper with the app in such a way that they don't only steal the user credentials, but they actually manipulate the behavior in such a way that you as a legitimate user of your banking app think you're making a transaction to your neighbor, friend, parent, whatever. But underneath the hood, the actual transaction details are manipulated, changed. So you're essentially transferring a different amount of money to someone you don't know, whereas you think, and the information which is presented to you makes you think that you're making the transaction you want to make. So this goes quite far also already in the mobile space. And with respect to the latter two, in terms of supply chain attacks and app tampering, this is equally applicable to mobile apps. Mobile apps are nowadays also comprised of many different components, where you have many different third-party libraries included in such mobile apps, and also there you don't always know what the state of security or the actual payload of these third-party libraries is. There might be one thing slightly different compared with JavaScript or web apps, and that's related to app tampering. While on runtime tampering, I would say it's a similar concern. With mobile apps, you also have the case that the actual app, which is available in the App Store, can be downloaded by someone with malicious intent, reverse engineered, tampered with. They add additional functionality, and they upload the recompiled application back to the App Store, and with, let's say, social engineering attempts, making it look like the original banking app, in order to fool people to use these, where underneath the hood you might directly leak your user credentials, your information to the attacker-controlled app.
Makes sense. And you mentioned that first attack you mentioned, where the destination account is replaced. We have that exact same attack on a website, the so-called man in the browser, that's completely done on the client side and could happen completely, without detection on the server side. So again, another example where client-side detection monitoring is essential. Yeah. All right.
So let me take it over a little bit from here. So what we've seen in the past 10, 15 years is essentially that all facets of payments have gone mobile. You already said, Carlos, that you can't remember when you actually visited a bank. I do, and to be honest, it's not a pleasant of experiences, because it takes a lot of time and typically many meetings to get done what you need to get done. So hill the mobile channel or the digital channel. But kidding aside, what we have seen in the past, let's say 10 years, 5 years, is that most of the forms of payment we know are now also available either through web or through mobile, so through different digital channels. And that literally goes from your banking to making payments, trading, QR code-based payments, peer-to-peer payments, e-commerce type of transactions, and nowadays even for merchants, in order to be able to accept digital payments in store through their mobile device. So replacing essentially physical devices with app-based or digital-based alternatives. What we also see, and this is more depicted on the right side, is based on the data we see, is that this seems to be still in a transitioning phase, meaning that the numbers are still rising in terms of adoption. If I would look at my own behavior, let's say 5 years back, I was used to pay everything with cash. If I look now, I don't have cash, I don't use cards. Almost every payment I do is on my mobile, when I buy something in the store or when I buy something online. So in quite a short time, the behavior of many consumers, I would say, has significantly changed. What's important to realize is that transition in terms of how we make payments, how we do our financial business, has not only changed in the way we do it, but also on the type of, let's say, devices or solutions or platforms we do it with. What I mean with that is that we kind of had a change from using devices and solutions which were really designed and developed to make these type of transactions and payments with security in mind, to having apps or web forms facilitating or performing these payment functionalities, but now not on devices which really have been developed with security in mind on dedicated built-for-purpose devices, but now we're using our mainstream smartphones or tablets or desktop devices for this purpose. And this is an important paradigm shift from a security perspective, because you, in this new situation, you can't rely on the underlying devices anymore for its security. So that means that the boundary of security is essentially moving to the solutions which are providing this functionality. So the actual apps itself. And that's quite a fundamental change. Well, we had some recent headlines here. This is not intended to be complete. It's more to give an indication. So from the previous discussion just now, we kind of say that because you're using your common devices to make payments, to receive payments, etc., you can't rely on the devices itself anymore. So we're relying on devices which have not been built or designed with security in mind for this specific use case. So why is that a concern? Well, it is a concern because you can't rely on these platforms to do the security for your apps, which means that you have to secure these apps yourself. And this is still a challenge, I think, in the industry, which we also see in many of the recent headlines, different forms of malware being distributed, which are becoming more and more sophisticated, expanding from the capabilities of just trying to steal your user credentials to, without you being able to notice it, manipulate your actual transactions on the fly while you're making transactions. That's quite sophisticated and scary, because it's also difficult, perhaps for you as a consumer, to deal with this if it happens. How do you even prove that this has happened? Besides the money being gone from your account, we see many examples of smartphones, of devices being compromised, becoming more and more sophisticated. We often only see the high-end attacks in this space. So one of the examples here is from the NSO group with Pegasus, well-known example, I think, in the industry. But that's what reaches the news. There's so many examples of these type of vulnerabilities which are exploited in one way or another, which will not get to the news, but they are essentially there. What we also see from our own research by our Zimperium labs is that the amount of malware and the amount of exploits for 0 days in mobile devices is still growing at almost at an exponential rate. So from our past global mobile threat report from 2022, what we have discovered there is that the amount of new malware samples only in that specific year was over 2 million, which means almost 5,000 unique strains per day. And these numbers are quite staggering if you think of it, because with that amount of potential threats or different strains which might target these type of applications, it becomes quite difficult also to protect against that. During the transition here, we had one challenge with one slide. So this is the secret slide with data, which we'll not expose during this webinar. But kidding aside, this was more data which we had from our own research with respect to actual samples and amount of instances of malware or other threats which we've seen on mobile devices. Let's keep that for a later moment.
Exactly. Thanks, Tim. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about regulations. And to your point, with such a staggering number of different types of strains of attacks, it is important that regulations also accompany this evolution and focus on these topics to help companies be in the right path in order to be prepared to deal with these threats, right? But just talking about regulations in general, financial privacy laws, they regulate the manner of which financial institutions handle the non-public financial information of consumers, but Yeah, and like I said, however, a lot of times they're not up to speed with certain types of threats. And from what we can see, especially in the US, unfortunately, and we're saying this because in Europe, GDPR and PSD2 are already very much focused on data security, and they mention already source code as a point to be considered. When it comes to North America, there are a number of regulations addressing the banking and financial industry, of course, but they are, for one, they are diverse, very diverse, because a lot of them act at both of it depends. They have federal and state level regulations, and depending on the type of charter a banking institution has and its organizational structure, it may be subject to different types of banking regulations. And so the point is that this already makes it hard for banking institutions to know exactly what they should follow and prioritize. And the other aspect is that none of them today are clearly covering the aspect of securing application scope, as it is already, kind of happening in Europe, right? So the fact that there isn't a norm or an act that focuses specifically on code protection for banking application represents, a concern, I believe, because institutions basically don't know exactly how to approach this issue, if they should prioritize this issue or not. And the reality is, if the code is at risk, users are at risk, businesses are at risk, and sensitive data is also at risk. So, I think it would be an important step to see, or even more evolution on this matter in the European regulations, but also definitely in the North America regulations, in Canada and the US, because it's important to have this proactive and this preventive approach to code protection, to be able so that organizations can be prepared essentially for this ever-changing problem, right? Let's see. Sorry, I think that's you now, Tim.
Yeah, if we translate this also to mobile again, and this also is an extension of the slide which was secret a few minutes ago. What we've seen, or what we see as the main threat factors or attack factors, effectively to these financial apps, to these mobile apps, are essentially fourfold. Some or most more technical, but some also more social engineering related. The easiest one perhaps to understand is, you shouldn't do banking if you're in an airport and you're connecting to a Wi-Fi. You don't know who's telling you that that's actually the airport's Wi-Fi and not some malicious actor sitting there with its own hotspot. So network-related attacks, man-in-the-middle related attacks, there are essentially an attack factor. That can be as simple as the example of a rogue network, but it can also be much more sophisticated in terms of stripping away an SSL connections or SSL stripping in order to get access to the data which is exchanged between the handset, the app, and the server side. If we look a bit further and go into the device, you could say there's two variants there, one more passive and the other one more invasive. The invasive one could be manipulation of apps at runtime. So at the moment you're actually using your banking app or financial app, if the device is compromised or when the device is compromised. So if an attacker has remote access and is able to manipulate with your app based on knowledge he gained by analyzing your app because it's publicly available, then he can also exploit potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses in the protection of that app. And this is also what the more sophisticated strains of malware are able to do, in order to manipulate transactions or get specific data, for instance, card data or other sensitive or data they can monetize effectively out of the application. That's the more invasive type, or also dynamic or runtime type of attack. You could also think of more or less invasive type of attacks, and that's for instance malware sitting in the device, waiting for you to start your banking app, and the moment you do, it will present an overlay, for instance, over the banking app, at the moment you're inserting your user credentials and your passphrase or your passcode, potentially also the 2FA or MFA related tokens in order to authenticate towards the backend. These malicious apps, they can essentially steal that information or capture that information and use that to impersonate you as a legitimate actor. Some of the numbers here, I will not go through all of them, but some of them are actually quite interesting. The first one is the increase we've seen in 2022 or 2021 to 2022 with respect to exploits or vulnerabilities in mobile devices. So you might all have seen at some point in time specific instances of mobile devices, both on Android as well as on iOS, where publications have been coming around regarding exploits or vulnerabilities in these devices. What we've seen in the time frame of our previous threat report is that the actual increase over 1 year time span was almost fivefold. So that's quite an increase in terms of actual exploits for vulnerabilities, which have been in the, let's say, the known area or zero-day vulnerabilities. And with that increase, that essentially also increases the potential risk for apps running on these vulnerable devices. One percentage kind of jumped out for myself, and that's the one on the complete left side at the bottom, stating that 5% of the devices worldwide is essentially compromised during the research we performed. If you think of it, 5% looks like a small number, but if you're thinking that this entails billions of devices, then it's actually in absolute numbers a gigantic amount of devices which are vulnerable and where you have some form of compromise or malware running on there. If we zoom in a little bit more in the financial domain, not only looking at the protection of app, but one of the things we've also encountered is that financial apps are becoming, I think, more of a target while still being vulnerable to different types of attacks. So what also came across from the research done last year was that 81% of the scanned applications, the financial applications, was also leaking sensitive information. And that could be privacy-related information from the user, but can also be payment-related information. This is a number coming from us, but we've seen other companies with similar numbers essentially in their research. So it's probably a good indicator of what the current state of the industry is.
Yeah, we on that point, I can add we're doing a lot of scanning in terms of client side to understand what type of scripts are running on web pages. And we see very similar numbers in terms of the exposure that these websites are having because simply by using so many third-party vendors on their web applications. And this doesn't mean that this should be stopped, right? It's very difficult to have a website and not use third-party vendors nowadays. But essentially, you need those vendors, those third-party scripts to run on your website. There's really no way to avoid that. The point is to be prepared, to be able to understand exactly what are those scripts, exactly what they're doing, and at the same time, the actual code that is you're using to build those web applications also protected to make it a little harder for someone to understand what's going on and act on it, right?
Yeah, and I think this equally applies to mobile apps. You're always reliant on components, on code from third parties. You don't always have the ability to develop or desire to develop everything in-house. It also doesn't make any sense nowadays. But it is good to be aware of the risk posture and the actual implementation of your app, meaning that you at runtime, but also before you publish an app, you should be able to get insight into potential weaknesses of your app, and during runtime also the threats posing towards your app. just as a good practice or as a necessity for your own risk management system. So if we look a little bit further in terms of why are apps such an easy target, because we've been discussing the transition from payments from built for purpose devices with security in mind to using the same functionality, or quite often nowadays even richer functionality on mobile devices or web devices. Why are apps such an easy target? Well, they're quite freely available. Everyone has access to them. So if you as a bank publish your app, it's not only your consumers downloading the app itself, but anyone with malicious intent can also download these apps. And that's just a stepping stone, because there's also plenty of tools available in order to analyze these apps. So if you don't have any protections against someone getting access to your code, then it's quite feasible or straightforward, I would almost dare to say, for someone with the right capabilities, understanding programming languages, having the ability to decompile and reverse engineer your apps into the original source code, or at least in order to understand what's going on beneath the hood. So there's plenty of tools available, plenty of free tools, also commercial tools used for this purpose. Next to that, and this is stepping from the reverse engineering side to actual manipulation of these type of apps, there are similar tools available which help security researchers, but also malicious people with malicious intent to manipulate these type of apps. And this is effectively used to develop malware, to repackage apps. So they download your app from the App Store, they reverse engineer it, they add additional functionality, they recompile it and upload it again to the App Store. This practice is well facilitated with the tools which are already available there. And secondly, what we've seen in combination of having these tools freely available and having always access to the actual apps itself, is that it's very challenging for most organizations to tackle this problem, because there's not always a high priority, I would say, for security, given quite an often push for time to market for releasing apps, which sometimes takes precedence over actual security. And once the app is actually deployed, keeping it or maintaining it also from a security perspective is quite a challenging task, not only from the developer side, but also to get your consumers to actually update their app once you have improved the security or patched certain vulnerabilities or patched certain bugs in the app itself. So the core message underneath is that what we said before, the mobile platform will not protect your application. It's not designed for that purpose. The application needs to protect itself, but then the challenge is, how do you effectively protect these mobile applications from the different threats which are there?
And this is true for any type of mobile app, right? It's true for native applications, but as well hybrid apps. They are freely available. Anyone can access the code, and if there's no plan on securing these applications, whatever the stack that is used, the problem is basically the same, right? That's your
absolutely. Well. If you haven't taken any countermeasures, you're effectively a sitting duck. It's, I would almost say, child's work. Anyone with a technical background in computer engineering is essentially able to do that if you haven't introduced any countermeasures there. If you have, then depending on how effective these countermeasures are, we will make that bridge in a minute, you can make it an extremely time-consuming and painful process, essentially, for actors with a malicious intent to understand how your app is functioning, to understand which assets or things you want to protect in your app and what they actually are, or to actually be able to compromise your app or repackage your app. So the more capable you are on the defending side, the more miserable your life, or sorry, the more miserable you can make the life of attackers trying to target your app.
Makes
So
sense.
this might be a little bit of a complicated picture, but this kind of continues on what we just said. So mobile apps are subject to reverse engineering and runtime manipulation. If you don't have any protections in your applications against that, it's I would use the word childs. No, that's not appropriate. I would say it's very feasible for people with malicious intent to manipulate your app and understand what's going on and target your apps. There are different protection solutions available, but they also have different characteristics. And I think it's good to be aware or sensible that depending on the use case and the actual risk appetite you have, you need to make your own consideration in terms of how you are going to protect your solutions. So what's presented in the graph here are essentially three categories of app protection solutions. Typical solutions which help you to obfuscate your app, to counter reverse engineering, but also to help detect potential threats towards the app and detect whether the platform in which the app is running is still in a trustworthy state, which we call typically as runtime application security protection. The, the two extreme type of solutions you have are either working on source code. These are typically tools which are more complex and difficult to use, but the benefit there is that you can completely tailor the security to your app. You have complete control most often, and you can achieve the highest level of security for your mobile apps. So that's the posture of these apps which are typically working on source code or are compiler based. On the other side, you have security solutions, um, typically called app wrappers or app sealers or packers, which kind of yeah, make it very easy for organizations to protect their apps. But the counter side or the downside of that is that they don't have any understanding of the actual functioning of the app, and they kind of create a layer around the app. The challenge there, from a security perspective, is that typically it's also quite easy for an attacker to remove that layer. So yeah, how do you say that? You could say that for these type of solutions, it's very easy to apply, but it's also very easy to remove for an attacker. So depending on your own risk appetite as an organization, you have to make your own judgment call consideration. What is most suitable for your business, for your use case? And I think that in the financial industry, you're probably, if not only due to regulation, perhaps not as explicit in the US, but definitely in Europe, you have to make your own consideration in terms of what type of tooling is best applicable for your financial apps. Next to the different apps or the different protection solutions which are there, there's one complexity to take into account. What you also need to take into account is that you have many different choices with respect to uh, development frameworks or programming languages you can use to develop your apps, which can be more on the native side with C, C++, Objective-C, or Kotlin, Swift, etc., to the more hybrid frameworks. Think of Flutter, Dart, React Native, where you have JavaScript. Each language and each development framework also has its own characteristics when it comes to security. And this is also what you need to take into account when you're selecting a tool to help you protect your mobile app.
Yeah, I think this is a great point because a lot of times when we're speaking to customers and they really are not aware of how their mobile application is built a lot of times. So I think that a key takeaway I would say from this slide is that when you're trying to plan how to secure your application, the first one first good question is how exactly is it built, right? Because the fact that is a lot of times a hybrid application, we're talking about components that are, some components are native, other components are built with JavaScript, and you can't just, protect half of it, if I can say it that way, right? It really is important to try to understand with your engineering team, exactly what's involved, and then find solutions that really cater for both aspects, right? Because it is, if someone is saying that you only need to protect the native part of a hybrid application, or vice versa, just JavaScript, something, there's going to be something that is going to remain exposed if that's the solution, right? So, and again, going back to your point on the previous slide, it needs to be a solution that is actually, making the hacker's job, or whoever has malicious intentions, actually hard, right? Otherwise, it's not really doing its job. So, and by the way, not just having, it's not just being effectively, increasing the resilience of the code, but also doing it in a way that does not brings errors or breaks your code, and so on and so forth, because that's also a lot of times what happens with simpler solutions, right?
Yeah, correct. And what you say about the determination of what to protect is also, of course, connected to how you design your application. It's quite common that you have different languages, a part native, a part in a non-native language, or hybrid. That's all fine, but be aware what you need to protect, and that can be in any part of the application depending on your own design choices. But those design choices should also drive your decision on what you actually need to protect, and how. So maybe animations don't work here, I see, so it's the whole picture. So let me try to explain it a little bit. If we look at app development, and we see that starting in February of a specific year. If we look at app development, you could say there's a few phases there, from design, actual development, implementation, to the moment you compile your app. There will be some functional testing, perhaps some security testing, up to the moment you publish your app. Depending on the complexity of the app, the size, the functionality, the development team, the priority that might take a certain time. In this example, this took from February to May. So let's take this as a base point. Most organizations think that their actual exposure to threats actually starts to count at the moment they publish the application, until the moment they update the actual application itself. But it's good to realize that the tools which are used to secure your app, once you've selected a specific tool, they're not the newest of the breed at the moment you actually protect your app, because these tools have also been developed a few months before. So what you see in this example, you might compile your actual app in April and publish it in May, but the tool you're using to protect that app has been, for instance, updated the last time in January. So where you think that the counter essentially starts to tick with respect to exposure to attacks and the ability to counter the newest attacks starts to count in May, in reality, it actually starts already in January, which means that any novel attack, any new attacker capability or tools, most often by most tools, is not detected if it is published or released or created after this specific date of January, where the application protection tool is generated. And this kind of creates a window of attack, a time window for attackers to update their capabilities, to update their tools, to use or abuse specific vulnerabilities in mobile devices and mobile apps, which you might not have taken into account when you actually developed or published the app in this case in May of a specific year. And then once you actually publish the app, there's typically also a certain release cycle before you really do an update where the security aspects are also updated again. So the actual time window for your app being vulnerable is typically larger than you think. And with the current nature of many apps, it essentially means that your security already degrades not at the moment you publish your app, but at the moment the actual app protection tool is released, which you are using to protect your app. And this is something which is often not realized by many app developers. So if we translate this a little bit in terms of where we see this development or evolution of AppSec go towards, what we currently have with most of the solutions is that they are static, meaning that they are signature based and they are determined at build time. But the actual protection capabilities are determined at build time of the actual protection tool, not necessarily of the app itself. What you would ideally like to have is the ability to be up to date against different forms of attack towards your app, um, regardless of when you released your app, without having to recompile and redistribute your app if a new attacker tool or a new vulnerability is discovered. So ideally, instead of having to yeah, keep your fingers crossed that your app is secure or not targeted because you're essentially vulnerable to newer attacker tools, attacker capabilities, malware, 0 days, etc. You want to be in the situation where your app is constantly secure and you have the ability to update the security posture and security capabilities of the app over the air without having to redevelop, recompile, retest, and redistribute your app. And this also helps to this also helps to overcome many of the current lacking patching practices which are there, especially in the consumer market, both on the device level as well as on the app level. And it will also take a large responsibility away for the actual development team with respect to continuously updating the app for updating the security capabilities by recompiling, redeveloping, recompiling, and redistributing the apps.
Yeah, the things don't work exactly the same way for web code or JavaScript code on a hybrid mobile application, but some of the aspects you mentioned are similar in a way that basically if you are if you're making every time you're making changes to your code, and that if on a CI/CD that happens constantly, right? With a solution, you need a solution that is actually going to change the way your code looks every time you protect it, right? So I think that's where it's similar. You need to have application security that takes that into account, so that you're not always pushing the same version of your code every time you're putting it out there. And there's an aspect of also of dynamic runtime protection on what we do, because the tools that are used for analyzing the code on a web instance, we have measures to deal with that. So we have anti-tampering or anti-debugging capabilities, and also the monitoring that is constantly happening. If you want to push your JavaScript code out there are measures you can take to be able to understand if that code is running on the right domain, if it's running on the right environment. Those are all things that basically I think translate to the points you're making here.
Yeah, I think that this might be a more fundamental difference between the concept then of web versus pure mobile, where the real mobile, so the apps really being distributed through the App Store based on native and etc. That these are typically more statically protected, so that protection against reversing and the runtime protections are determined by the tool at the moment it's applied to the binary. But there hasn't really been a way to update that over the air, or having the ability to detect unknown threats, so threats you have not seen before, where you don't have any signatures or indicators for, and having that available now as how we provide it, that's quite a unique feature. But it's good to hear that that this now kind of becomes on par with the rest of the domain.
So I think there's a similar point I wanted to make, but more with also and I mentioned this before, the actual scripts and the components that you're using on a web application, but also on a mobile application, to your point earlier. So there needs to be advanced techniques applied, a multi-layered approach. So things like obfuscation, environment checks, I was mentioning them right now, making sure you know where the code is going to run, making sure you know the domain, the right OS, and so on and so forth, and of course the runtime protection we were just talking about, and then the full visibility on the third-party code that is running on the banking website, right? The way we suggest companies do that is to start with a website inventory that basically gives them a full visibility on all the scripts that are actually running. It also shows you if your code is exposed, if there's measures you can take in terms of protecting the code, the first-party code, just to be clear. And that already is, a good starting point to make sure that the development teams are pushing applications that follow the standard in terms of, or what it should be the standard of application security.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in a similar concept that also applies to mobile apps. So always use a multi-layered approach. It's not one layer you should rely upon, because if that's stripped, you're essentially left vulnerable. So you always have I would say almost the similar layers in terms of preventing reverse engineering, so obfuscating the code, being able to verify if the application is still untampered with, so integrity hasn't changed. As well as having the ability to determine if the application is not being instrumented or running on a device which is potentially a threat towards your application itself.
Mm-hmm. So we are close to the end of our conversation, and we thought that it would also be interesting to leave with some final considerations that are basically a recap of what we have been talking about up until now. And so, as we discussed, banking and financial services organizations are experiencing definitely an accelerated digital transformation. And the fact is that, like we were saying, there's no way around it because it's necessary for business. It's what enables, innovative customer experiences. It's what enables competition, business growth, and so on. But the point that we really want to make is that it comes at a cost of, increased complexity and risk. And so companies need to be prepared for that, because apps are going to become easily exposed to client-side attacks, mobile apps, hybrid apps, or web apps, and that can jeopardize the business and leak users' data. On the other hand, we mentioned regulations. It's a problem that are still being updated to reflect this threat landscape, this changing threat landscape. And so I think, conversations like this and others that I think at Jscrambler try to do, and Zimperium as well, I think the focus is trying to show the urgency of protecting source code effectively as a means to secure these applications that users are, essentially trusting with their, private data, with their, credit card information, and so on and so forth. And hopefully, that will also help, these regulations, especially in North America, become more, updated and more, accompanying the changes that we are seeing in the market. So, in the absence of this, the bottom line is, from my perspective, is that the financial services organizations must be ready to, on their own, adapt their security posture. That is, if they want to be proactive in preserving, their application's integrity, their revenue, in consequence, and their reputation. Tim, would you like to add some final thoughts as well?
Yeah, I fully agree. And if you translate this to developers, I think, as we discussed, it's important to realize in your app what your assets are, what you need to protect, how you intend to design your app, so you can take into account the best strategies in terms of protecting your application from tampering. But also to make sure that the solution you're using for that purpose, both on the development side as well as on the protection side, are essentially fit for purpose. And the main point I think we both wanted to make sure that you're constantly protecting against the current threats instead of having the ability to protect against threats of 6 months old, because those are not going to be the threats which your app is going to face.
Exactly, makes sense.
So,
All right, so yeah, go ahead, Tim. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
no, nothing. This is good.
All right, sounds good. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A section of our webinar. I want to see if we have some questions on the chat. Just give me a second. Let me see if I pressed the right buttons. Okay, we have Marcelo thanking for the excellent explanations. Thank you, Marcelo. Give it a bit more time. Okay, we have one question from Mike. Hi, everyone. Team touched briefly on the 2022 Global Mobile Threat Report regarding the 2023 edition. What are the main insights you expect to have? Do you want to comment on that, Tim?
Yeah, I want to say that
Tough
was
question.
no, but kidding aside, the next version of the Global Mobile Threat Report will be published likely this month. So I can't answer your question now, but in either next week or in the coming 2 weeks, I will have the complete report for you available to dive into.
There you go, Mike. So just wait a few more days and you'll get your answer. Let me see if there's anything else. I think. Thank you, Mike. I think that should be it. All right. If you have any questions, we are at your disposal afterwards, of course. So I think with that, I would like to thank you so much for your time and for your attention. And I also wanted to extend a big thank you to Tim from Zimperium for presenting very interesting insights to us today. Thanks, Tim.
No, thank you for the invitation.
And for all of you attending, you'll receive a recorded version of this conversation. If you don't, please feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to provide it. And if you have any, like I was saying before, if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us using the email you see here. There you go. Or via our social media channels. You just have to look for Jscrambler and you'll find our blue shield. And so with that, thank you very much. And take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.